The Tepperspectives podcast is made possible in part by the MBA Class of 2016 Technology Fund.
What are the new norms that are going to emerge around consent? And that's going to take regulation. It's going to take changes in corporate policy where companies like X actually put in their corporate policies, here's the safeguards, here's the restrictions we're going to place on it. If you are using an image of a person, we need consent from that person.
The recent controversy around Grok, an AI assistant created by xAI, raises a lot of ethical questions. In late 2025, X released a feature that allowed users to create an estimated 3 million sexualized images, including 23,000 of children, from December 29th, 2025 to January 9th, 2026. The ongoing conversation around this has led to discussions about freedom of speech, sexually objectifying individuals without their permission, and the ethics of responsible use. Welcome to the Tepperspectives podcast. I'm Emily DeJeu, Assistant Teaching Professor of Business Communication. And today we're talking with Derek Leben, who has researched and written extensively about business ethics and technology. Derek is an Associate Teaching Professor of Business Ethics at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University. His recent book, AI Fairness, Designing Equal Opportunity Algorithms, is available from MIT Press. Derek Leben, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. So I want to start with you walking us through how on earth this happened.
Right. So we have this sort of gradual increasing of technological capability where in the past we had, say, tools like Photoshop, where you were able to take an image and apply some kind of software technology to it to change that image in certain ways. And there are legal norms and ethical norms around what is acceptable ways of doing this. But what changes with, say, generative AI in this context is that now we have very little skill that's needed to do that. So you don't need to be an expert in Photoshop to be able to do this. You just type text into a prompt. And you also have maximal convincingness. Yeah. So as opposed to Photoshop, which in the 90s and 2000s was not very good, now all of a sudden the outputs of generative AI systems look really, really convincing. So these kinds of tools are just sort of ramping up the convincingness and ramping down the skills that you need to be able to produce these at large scales.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I have never used Photoshop because I can't use Photoshop.
Right.
I find it completely terrifying. But I could, if I wanted to, upload an image to ChatGPT, describe, for instance, I could put a photo of my dog in there. I could say, put him in a cute top hat, situate him in the library of a country manor, and it would work, right? And I wouldn't need anything except my ability to type that prompt.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that I like to think about the ancient times of 2022 and 2023, where we talk about things like deep fakes and Gen AI systems that generate images via prompts, where I say something like, show me an image of a tomato who's a superhero, and it generates something like that. But now what we have is that you can upload an image and a text at the same time and say something like, I want you to change this image in this way. And it's really amazing. It is truly incredible the way it can do this. So if you're, a real estate agent and you're selling a property, you might upload an image of the property inside and say, I want you to add new wallpaper to this. I want you to put new furniture in this, and it can do that. And obviously these systems are being marketed for consumer purposes too, where I just say something like, okay, I want you to adjust the shadows or remove my ex from this picture.
Yeah,
and
right.
it will remove a picture of your ex-boyfriend from that picture.
Yeah.
So you could be Stalin-esque about all of your photos now.
Yeah, a lot of power with very low barrier to entry, I guess is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Kind of terrifying. My guess is when xAI, offers this up as a new application in late December, perhaps, I don't know, not accounting for how people are and what people tend to do when they have sort of new powers, right, new abilities. And so, of course, harm then ensues. And I wanted to get your take on this. It seems like we're seeing different layers or levels of harm. So there's obviously harm to individual people, harm to people whose images are used without their consent in horrifying ways. But I also wonder if we zoom out, if we could think about the social harm that ensues when maybe we're not personally touched by this, but we live in a society in which this is not only possible, it's ongoing. We're hearing arguments in defense of these kinds of applications. I wonder if philosophy gives us a way to think about layers of harms or levels of harms.
Absolutely. And so you've actually talked about three important ideas here, philosophical ideas. One of them is harm. One of them is permission or consent. And the other one is, what did the agent, in this case, the company X, what did they have in mind when they actually were developing this product and releasing this product? What did they want people to be using it for? What did they maybe foresee people using it for? And so we could talk about each of those three ideas, and each of them has a big philosophical tradition behind it. So when we talk about harm, there is both, like you're saying, harm to an individual, but also damage to our entire society, to institutions, to ways that people interact with each other. And so here, when we talk about, say, image generators, and the ability to now edit these images with very little skill and with maximal convincingness, there are obvious harms where you have, like, Taylor Swift, who says, I've been harmed because people can now create all these nude images of me. You have people, especially kids, like high school kids, in the incident in Westfield High School in New Jersey from last year, where a lot of them are non-consensually having images transformed into nude images of them. And especially when you talk about kids, right, there's some very serious damages that happen here. A lot of kids, especially high school kids, are being blackmailed with nude images. And I think the sort of jury's out right now about the positive and negative impacts of generative AI systems. We acknowledge there's some harms, but there's also some benefits. And there's some moral theories, like utilitarianism, which will say, well, we just add all the harms together and all the benefits and do a cost-benefit analysis. And we say, yeah, there's going to be some harms, but there's also going to be a lot of great things. I mean, you're able to edit your family images now. You're able to make fun images and parodies, and there's some benefit for this. So the utilitarians will say, well, we got to add up all the happiness and suffering and say, is this overall good? I like to play this game that I might play with you right now, which is, does X cause more overall harm or good in our society? Oh, sure. And we could play that with things like guns or alcohol or gambling. And I don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, right? So would you say that, say, social media platforms have caused more overall harm or good in our society?
Oh, well, I should clarify. I don't think I'm necessarily representative. I think they have caused incredible harm.
Sure.
I am far on the harmful side of that.
Oh, so you say more harm than good?
Way more harm than good.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. And so I can ask the same question about, say, generative AI systems. And of course, we can break it down into, well, language models or image generators or video generators, right? Do you have any sense of image generators? Do you think they're doing currently and are likely to do more overall harm than good?
Again, and I'm going to out myself here as kind of a little bit of a tech skeptic.
And
so it's probably, I think, overall harm would be my takeaway. Yeah.
So the second ethical idea that you mentioned besides harm is consent. And so a lot of this hinges on what's called implied consent. And there's been a lot of discussion about this in the literature on ethics of technology, because when companies say, well, you post a picture on Instagram, now I can use it to, say, train my AI system, or you've given me permission to do this. So a lot of companies like Stability have made this argument. If you're an artist, you post something on a personal website, I can use this to train my AI system because by posting it somewhere in public, you've provided me some kind of implied consent.
Right.
And so this question of consent is an old one, and it produces some surprising conclusions, namely that you could consent to things that might be harmful to you.
Yeah, especially when I feel like the consent piece we're talking about in the realm of technology is so often accept the terms and services,
right?
Which nobody reads because they're long and incomprehensible, and we just want our phones to work, or we really need this app to work now because I need it to perform this function.
Yeah.
Right. And so often I'm guilty of this. I find myself clicking the yes, accept, thinking I probably hate what I have just accepted.
Yeah.
But I live in a world in which I need this to work for me right now.
Yeah.
And I don't have another way to do it.
I'll be honest, I am shocked and baffled by how much people are willing to, by apparent consent, give people access to their private information.
Yeah.
I mean, as a professor, students send us like MRI images and x-rays and emails all the time.
For please excuse my
Exactly.
absence.
Excuse my absence. Here's an MRI image. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't want to see that.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a FERPA violation. But second of all, I don't want to look at that.
Yeah,
right? Don't
right.
show me this.
Yeah.
I did some consulting work in 2019 with an insurance company where they were operating in Southeast Asia. And they were doing things like, okay, we'll give you discounts if you upload images of the food that you're eating to show us you're eating in healthy ways, and show us selfies of yourself on a periodic basis, and we'll do a BMI estimation. And if you're losing weight, we'll give you discounts too. And I was asking, what do the customers think about this? And their marketing group was like, they love it. They love it. Customers have no complaints.
Yeah.
Whereas I suspect in the European Union and the U.S. that the public might feel differently about that. Now, that's why ethics is important, because there's lots of cultural variation in the norms around privacy and property, and there's lots of legal variation around the restrictions here. But what ethics is supposed to be is a set of universal norms that are what we might call human values that all human beings share, and say, okay, well, we all care about harm, or we all care about consent. And what kinds of harms are universal to human beings? What kinds of consent are universal to human beings? So the way that I actually approach some of these issues, you said one problem with consent is that people don't actually read the terms and conditions, or they might consent to things actually that might not be ideally what they would consent to. I usually use a kind of consent in my thinking called hypothetical consent. And this has a precedent in, say, medical ethics. Like if you bring somebody into the emergency room and they are going to die unless you give them a blood transfusion right away. Imagine they refuse the blood transfusion.
Sure.
What do you think the doctor should do in that circumstance? Do you think the doctor should override their refusal and save their life, or stand back and allow them to die?
It's tricky because doctors have an obligation to do no harm, and I believe to render care where care is needed.
Right. So in bioethics, we say that doctors have this obligation for beneficence. They want to do good for the patient, but they also have this non-maleficence obligation to not do harm, and it seems like you can't do both, right?
Yeah,
You've got that conflict.
that's a tension.
So personally, what do you think the doctor should do?
Oh gosh, I hope that I hope a doctor would feel safe to override that.
Ooh.
But I don't know, maybe not.
Interesting. So you would want the doctor to override their refusal?
Well, I guess that's tricky, because I guess it depends on why somebody's refusing.
Exactly.
If it's a religious obligation, then that's a big violation.
I totally agree.
But if it's somebody who you think this person is not currently in their right mind, or not capable of making their own decisions, right? Like a young child or someone with a severe mental impairment.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. And so this is what hypothetical consent is about. It is saying, okay, this person might actually either refuse something or agree to something in the moment, given their current information and circumstances. But I'm going to actually appeal to something else, like what they hypothetically would agree to under ideal conditions.
Yeah.
So if they were fully informed and rational, like a Jehovah's Witness would still reject the blood transfusion.
Yeah,
and so I'm going to say I respect that.
Yeah.
But if a person believes that Bill Gates has put like nanobots into the blood and is going to control my mind, I would say, well, the fully informed version of that person would not consent to that.
Right.
Similarly, I might say, well, if they are being coerced somehow, or if they're just so afraid of needles, that their best version of themselves would not agree to that.
Right.
Now, I think that this applies in business ethics quite a lot, and especially in image and likeness. So image and likeness issues, we can say, well, there's some kind of harm or damage done by editing your image and likeness with AI systems. But what if there's no harm done because it's like in private? Or what if it's minimal harm, or the harm is outweighed by the benefit? Or I could say you actually consent to it, or you provide some implied consent to it. But hypothetical consent is very strong.
Yeah.
And it says, does this go against your values as a person? Does this in some way violate your conception of yourself? What a fully informed and rational version of you would want?
Yeah.
And so I could say something like, well, I might manipulate this image in ways that you don't like, but are not necessarily a violation of what your fully informed and rational self would want. But most of the time, it's going to be very strict, very restrictive, and say, even if you agree at the moment, I'm going to still say There are some uses of your image and likeness that are not what the fully informed, rational version of you would want. And that's what I need to think about when I'm editing someone's image.
Yeah.
It's not just what do they actually agree to, what is actually harming them, but what would they hypothetically agree to.
Yeah, which is kind of a perspective-taking empathy exercise in some ways, which is productive. I mean, we could probably use more of that in discussions around AI and how we engage with it.
I would say the difference is that empathy might be, first of all, sort of feeling another person's feelings as opposed to trying to sort of think other person's thoughts. But the other difference is that I'm less worried about how you actually feel and more worried about how some hypothetical version of you, like the best version of you, would feel.
Yeah.
So here's another example from business ethics. Imagine you're a tattoo artist and someone walks into the tattoo parlor and wants like a giant spider tattoo on their face.
Yeah.
Now, the libertarian would say, look, you're a consenting adult. Get in the chair. You're the boss. You know what's best for you. And the utilitarian might refuse that on the grounds that, well, you might want that and consent to it, but it's not good for you.
Yeah.
Whereas the contractarian might say, well, like, would the best version of you want this?
A face tattoo.
And I might need to know more about you in order to know that.
Sure.
This also pops up in AI image manipulation and generation when we talk about dead people.
Yeah.
So there was a case from 2025 where there was a man in Arizona who was killed in a road rage incident. And during the trial, this was the sentencing part of the trial after the person who killed him was convicted of murder, the judge allowed for families to submit some documents to the court, plead the court. And his wife, his widow, of the victim actually generated an AI avatar of the man and had him say a script that she had written where he said that he forgives his killer. Now, what's interesting about this case, well, there's a lot of interesting things about this case, is that the judge accepted it and said, I found this very moving. I liked this very much.
Yeah.
Right? Now, there's some analogies we make here to, say, proxy consent in medicine, where you might give your next of kin or something proxy consent for your medical decision making, but why?
Yeah.
Now, one answer from medical ethics is, well, they are the people who are most likely to know what you would have wanted.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that this does apply in image and likeness issues here in AI systems, whether it's AI avatars or voice clones or Grok editing images. You could say something like, well, what would this person have wanted?
Sure.
Would James Earl Jones have wanted us to be saying these things in the voice of Darth Vader? Would Martin Luther King or Taylor Swift wanted us to portray them in this way? And in the case of the Arizona man, would he have wanted his image portrayed that way? Now, that's really hard with dead people because as they get more and more dead, it's hard to go back in time and figure out what would they have wanted.
Yeah.
But we can maybe try our best to reconstruct, here's what they would have wanted. And otherwise, I think there's like a baseline level where we say, okay, I'm just going to assume as a baseline that most people don't want to be portrayed doing humiliating, embarrassing, sexualized things, anything like that. And maybe you might hypothetically want that, but I'm going to need a lot of evidence to sort of override that. And then maybe we'll allow people to generate images in those contexts.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder how many tech people are listening who should be instructed by this form of consent that you're offering, which I appreciate.
So far I've just been talking about like what are the ethical uses, you know, but that third ethical concept that you brought up was, well, what is going through the company's mind or the minds of the people in the company.
Right.
Are they expecting, anticipating, or to use a more technical word, foreseeing that their users are going to be using the system in these harmful ways or dangerous ways?
Yes, because I think that's a real question. Was this a blip? Was this you are using this in ways we did not anticipate? Or this is proceeding as expected?
In U.S. law, there are these two different standards for corporate liability. One of them is called due care, and the other one is called strict liability. And due care basically says you are responsible for damages whenever you as a company could have reasonably foreseen those damages and also were able to prevent them. On the other hand, strict liability cares less about what you could have foreseen and more about just the damages themselves. And it says, look, this kind of damage happened from normal expected uses of the product. Even if you didn't necessarily foresee those, they are things that we can still blame you for. And especially when we talk about technology, the problem is that what constitutes the sort of direct damage caused by a system is a big problem. There are ancient debates about this. So in Plato's Republic, Book 1, Plato says, look, if I give you a knife knowing that you're going to go and use that knife to stab somebody, am I responsible for that? And I could say the same thing about this kind of system, which is if I'm giving you this AI image editor, knowing it's very easy for people to make harmful images, deep fakes, nude images of people with it, am I responsible for that?
Right.
Now, a strict libertarian might say, no, that's up to you, especially when another agent comes in. This is the idea that another agent acts as kind of a lightning rod. In law, this is called the learned intermediary principle, which is to say, if I give you a tool and then you are some knowledgeable person with expertise who is responsible for using that tool wisely, then I'm not responsible for you going out and doing bad things with it. The tech companies, X in particular here, could say, tech companies don't create nude images, people create nude images. And we just give them the tools to be able to do so.
Facilitate that process.
Exactly.
Right.
Now use the verb facilitate. There's a lot of verbs that are used here. Perpetuate, enable, facilitate, aid and abet, amplify, and they all carry with them these different degrees of causal force. And so we could say something like, well, how much causal force does X have? But also, like you said at the beginning, what's going through their minds? Did Elon Musk and others at the company, did they expect that people were going to use Grok in this way? I have a hard time believing they wouldn't. I mean, we know people are going to use tools to do these kinds of things with them. And so it seems strange to say that they could not have foreseen people using Grok for this purpose.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it's difficult to say for certain, but that seems like the more logical interpretation as opposed to you're using this in ways we never envisioned when we created this extremely powerful, low barrier to entry image manipulator.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered a lot of the things I was hoping we could talk about, but here's another question, and I think this sort of attaches nicely to what we've been talking about. We're thinking about these various kinds of harms and how social media companies are interacting with those harms, right? I think attending that might be a question about what obligations, if any, do social media companies, maybe companies broadly, what obligation do they have to consider things like individual well-being or societal well-being? And I'm asking this, I'm thinking about, we live in an age when a company, and we're a business school, so we know this, a company's obligation first and foremost is to its shareholders. We have a duty to the shareholders. But that can, and I think we've lived to see times when it does, seem to directly conflict with this idea of the common good. What is good for people at large? Can you speak to that? What could philosophy tell us or maybe show us about what obligation, if any, companies have and how they could thread the needle when those obligations seem in conflict?
I like to think about business as creating things of value that people want to buy and that you will make profit as a side effect of making things that are valuable. And so if you're doing that, right, you are genuinely concerned. You're concerned about making sure that you're not harming people and that you're giving them things that they want and that their best selves would want.
Even a lot of what you've been sharing, like the idea of, the hypothetical consent. Would you, the best version of you, consent to this? I think we can safely say it seems like a lot of society is built around corporate behaviors that aren't necessarily abiding by these things you're putting forth. So what I'm wondering as we're wrapping up, Derek, could you talk a little bit about how would you imagine this, if at all, being possible en masse? Like, as opposed to maybe lone CEOs who are virtuous, or maybe a lone tech company who says we're going to adopt this hypothetical standard of consent. How could we, and if so, how could we see this maybe rolled out broadly?
Right. So I like to think about ethics, and here our ethics group at Tepper even divides itself into two parts. We have our sort of normative ethics group, which is me and Taewon Kim and John Hooker, and then we have our behavioral ethics group, which is Taya Cohen and Brandy Avon and others who work on these questions of, okay, well, normative ethics is telling us where we want to be, where we want to go, and behavioral ethics is how do we get there? Now, it's not only behavioral ethics, it's also these questions of operational organizational psychology, these questions about law and mechanisms. How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And I do not pretend to have all the answers to that. I know it's true. We want to get up there. I sometimes think about, say, the prisoner's dilemma, where, we're in this equilibrium and we see this like Pareto optimal position up there if we cooperate with each other. It's just we're in this local minimum of the Nash equilibrium where we're defecting, we're cheating on each other. How do we move from here to there? I think there's a lot of ways to do it. I agree with you. I don't want to rely on like the kindness of well-intentioned executives, sure. Even though I agree. I think there are well-intentioned executives. I think most of them are well-intentioned. Instead, I think we need laws and regulations, and unfortunately, we are always playing catch-up there because tech moves very quickly and regulations move very slowly. We also need cultural norms that change, and we're getting that around AI systems over time. So we're already getting younger people saying, no, I don't want to use AI systems for certain kinds of purposes. Mm-hmm. And we're learning, okay, what kinds of uses do we want to use AI for? Do I want to use AI for emails, especially personal emails, or not? When I'm using them to edit images, like what are the new norms that are going to emerge around consent? And that's going to take regulation. It's going to take changes in corporate policy, where companies like X and companies like Google and companies like OpenAI, who are building these image generators, actually put in their corporate policies, here's the safeguards, here's the restrictions we're going to place on it. If you are using an image of a person, we need consent from that person. Whereas, say, OpenAI doesn't do that. If I want to make an image of you and put it into the ChatGPT interface and have it edit that, I don't need any verification that you actually gave consent to that. But those are safeguards that OpenAI as a company, not just Sam Altman as a CEO, that they could put around it today. So it requires regulation, it requires corporate policy, it requires changes in our culture, like just how do we use it, right? Even if I'm allowed to use it this way, there's some uses that now are getting, I would say, stigmatized in our culture. And that's actually a powerful force. I like that. I think there are some kinds of uses that should be stigmatized. Like if you find out that your friend generated a text to you using ChatGPT or Gemini, I think you would feel weird about that. You would feel offended. You would say, oh, that's creepy. Yeah. That's not the right use of this.
We found out someone wrote their wedding vows or something.
Yeah, exactly.
You might have a little side eye for that.
Yeah.
They drop a few levels in your esteem.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in terms of mechanisms, there's all these different levers that we're going to have to adjust in order to get where we want to go. And it's not just one size fits all solution.
Good stuff. And kind of ending on a hopeful note, still aspirational, but still hopeful. Well, Derek, thank you so much for talking with us today. And thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit tepperspectives.cmu.edu for more podcasts, articles, and videos.
The Tepperspectives podcast is a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Tepper School of Business. To learn more, visit tepperspectives.cmu.edu.